Welcome to Wildflower Weekly with Ashley Adair. By now, I'm sure you realize that I'm Ashley. I work as an Ag and Natural Resources educator in Montgomery County, Indiana. This is week 5 of our Wildflower Weekly series, and you might have noticed that the weather is much nicer this week compared to last week. We're hovering at around 72 degrees Fahrenheit, which is great hiking weather, and it's not even super sunny out today, so I think we'll have a great walk. This will be a great opportunity to identify any new species that have come up this week. Let's walk.
You can see the tree canopy and the shrubs in this woods are beginning to fill in a little bit. The forest floor is berry green, with many spring ephemerals starting to set seed this week. One of the birds you hear in the background is a tufted titmouse with a call that goes, "Peter, Peter, Peter." For those of you joining us for the first time, this video series has mostly been discussing spring ephemeral wildflowers, with a few surprises here and there. A spring ephemeral is a woodland plant that completes its above-ground life cycle in a short period of time, usually between March and June in Indiana. These plants provide many benefits to woodland animals at this time of year, serving as food and nectar sources for insects and larger animals alike. Let's set the scene. I'm walking at McCormick Woods, a Purdue-managed property near Purdue's campus. This week I walked on Earth Day, which was a great way to celebrate the day. The weather was about 72 degrees Fahrenheit and mostly cloudy. This park is open to the public for hiking and mountain biking and is partially managed by a local mountain biking organization. The image on the left is seen from the south entrance, which is adjacent to a golf cart path near the Ackerman-Allen Golf Course. If you've been following us for the past several weeks, you've noticed some changes over time in this image. I make sure to take a picture of it at the same spot each week so that you can see how much greening up is happening from week to week. Temperatures were warm during the day, but very cool at night for most of this week. So far, temperatures in April are running below normal compared to our usual average high of 63 and average low of 41. Just as a reminder, I'm hiking in northwest Tippecanoe County. If you're just as few as 15 miles north or south of me, you could be experiencing different conditions and different stages of plant growth and bloom time at this time of year. It's also worth noting that not every spring ephemeral species is found in this woodland. Some species that are common or semi-common in other woods, like Bishop's Cap, Virginia Bluebell, and Hepatica, are so far not found in McCormick Woods. If you have a species that you're wondering about, please feel free to reach out to me for identification. Contact information can be found in the description of this video. Here's how it works. Each slide has information organized in a particular way. Here is the photo, here is the scientific name, and here is the common name. Below the common name, you'll find some interesting facts about the plant, how it's pollinated, its role in the ecosystem, and more info. We've added an update graphic in the bottom right of some slides to show you what's happening with a flower that we saw last week or in weeks past. We're starting off with a new species this week. Jack in the Pulpit is a member of the arum family, which contains one other notable species that we'll hopefully see a little bit later in the season. In Asia, where there are many more species to observe in this genus, these plants are sometimes referred to as cobra lilies. Only 2 members of this genus are found in the eastern United States. The spadix in the middle of the flower is what we call jack, and the spathe, the structure surrounding jack, is the pulpit. The foliage of this plant is toxic, but the flower is attractive to fungus gnats and the fruits are eaten by birds. Here's a closer look at the spadix at the left. On the right is an individual plant with more striking dark red coloration. For this reason, this plant is sometimes called brown dragon. A cousin of this plant, the green dragon, is the plant that we'll be looking for a little bit later in the season. These plants bear some resemblance to the popular cultivated plant known as peace lily, which is in the same plant family. Now we're turning to an update on false mermaid weed, Floerkea proserpinacoides. This member of the meadowfoam family that we've kept an eye on for the last few weeks has finally produced the tiny flowers that are the very definition of inconspicuous. As you can see here, the flower only has 3 petals and 3 sepals, and it's extremely small. This plant's name comes from its tendency to have roots submerged in water while the rest of the plant exists in the air. The flowers are characteristic of autogamy, or self-fertilization. They are not showy, they produce very little pollen, and produce almost no nectar, so there's no attractiveness to insects for this plant. Unlike many of the other ephemeral species that we see in these woods, this plant is an annual, and its seeds only last a year or so in the soil. Because of all of these characteristics, it's a wonder that we see this plant at all. It could be threatened in areas where there's excessive traffic, presence of invasive species, and/or water pollution. Fungus alert! We have another rust species to discuss this week, this time Alotis podophyli, otherwise known as mayapple rust. Mayapple rust is fairly common in most mayapple populations, and it's not usually detrimental to the health of the colony. It's kind of fun to look for. It forms orange cup-like structures on the underside of the leaf. Rust is often bright orange. Remember Spring Beauty rust from a couple weeks ago? It was also orange and formed cup-like structures on the underside of the leaf. Our next species update this week is Pblox divaricata, otherwise known as wild blue phlox. This plant is inconspicuous and kind of fuzzy at first, so it's unassuming and you might not notice it along the path. When this plant blooms, it produces fragrant flowers, and there's quite a bit of variability across individuals, which we'll see in the next slide. You may be familiar with this plant due to its ornamental cousin, which is often planted in the home landscape. Phlox is blooming consistently across McCormick Woods this week, and it's interesting to spot flowers that have variations. Notice that some of the flowers might have 6 petals, whereas some of the others might only have 5 petals, and there's different types of indentations at the ends of these petals. The commonality amongst all these plants is that they come from the same vegetative structures, and the flowers themselves are almost always a bluish-purplish color. Another update for the week, we have an update on Dutchman's breeches, the pants plant. While some of the flowers are still blooming in the woods this week, this plant has begun to set seed. They look a little bit like tiny bean or pea pods. It's fun to look for these seed pods since it's easy to spot the flowers. Looking for the seed pods is fairly simple since many of these plants are still setting flowers, and the flowers are easy to see. Another update on white trout lily this week. There are a few individuals that are still in bloom, and some plants are beginning to set seed. The seed capsule, shown here at the left, has 3 chambers, and it each contains 2 rows of seeds. Remember cutleaf toothwort? It's been a while since we checked up on this plant, but it's now starting to set seed and it looks quite a bit different. Notice how it resembles other members of the mustard family when it sets seed. The elongated seed pods have tiny seeds inside. Let's turn our attention to another new species this week. Carex, otherwise known as true sedges. This plant might look like grass, but it's entirely different from grasses or broadleaves. It's easily identifiable by its triangular shape. One way to remember what a sedge is by keeping the phrase "sedges have edges" in mind. There are many species of sedge, and they're not always easy to differentiate from each other. There are many species of sedge, and they're not always easy to differentiate from each other. Most sedges prefer moist environments, and some even prefer to be sitting in standing water. Another sedge that you may have heard of is yellow nut sedge, which is in a different genus. Yellow nut sedge is considered an aggressive weed that is generally difficult to control. It starts to emerge at this time of year just like these Carex plants that we see here. Yellow nut sedge can be a nuisance weed in gardens and in lawns where it tends to grow more rapidly than turf grasses, especially in the heat of summer. Because of its biology, specific measures must be taken to control this plant. If you have questions about yellow nut sedge, please feel free to reach out to me using the contact information provided in the video description. In the photo on the right, you can see why we say sedges have edges and how distinctively triangular the stem of the plant is. Another seeding update from Claytonia virginica, the spring beauty. The Claytonia continues to flower profusely throughout this woods, but it's setting seed at the same time that it's continuing to bloom. The seed capsules are protected by structures called sepals while they mature. Sepals are usually the bottom part of the flower, but occasionally they can linger, like with Claytonia, in order to protect the seed. This plant tends to spread by reseeding, which ends up making the plant quite successful. You can get a closer look here of the seed capsules protected by the sepals. Another new plant this week is Caulophyllum thalictroides, blue cohosh. This is a plant that starts to get away from the traditional definition of spring ephemeral and starts getting into just a typical woodland wildflower that we keep an eye out for each year. The leaflets on this plant are somewhat distinctive, looking like 2 to 3-fingered mittens. It'll eventually produce deep blue fleshy seeds that resemble blueberries. The flowers are attractive to flies, parasitoid wasps, and bees. Parasitoid wasps are nice wasps to have in the garden because they can kill some of our pest insects like tomato hornworm. Mice and deer feed on the seeds, as well as certain birds, which end up distributing the majority of the seed. Another new species this week is Laportea canadensis, otherwise known as wood nettle. Like the introduced species that we know as stinging nettle, this plant has stiff hairs that sting when touched. Unlike the introduced stinging nettle, wood nettle is an important host species for several species of moths and butterflies, including the comma, question mark, and red admiral butterflies, and the bomoloca moth. This plant is wind-pollinated, so it will produce very inconspicuous flowers. It is monoecious, meaning it produces male and female flowers on a single plant. Corn is another plant that is monoecious and wind-pollinated. The tassel is male and the silks are female. We have a wildlife alert this week. I was walking along the trail and noticed a familiar sound echoing out of this hollow log along the trail. I decided to record and share this experience with all of you. Take a listen. This sound is made by Hyla versicolor, otherwise known as the gray tree frog. This familiar sound is produced by the tree frog primarily at night, but sometimes it will call in response to loud sounds heard during the day. These loud sounds could include everything from thunder to traffic going down the highway. The breeding season is beginning and will run through August. Females select mates based on the male's call. These frogs often inhabit hollow logs like the one shown here, but they can sometimes be found sunning on branches or on the sides of buildings if the conditions are right. There is a pond nearby McCormick Woods, which is the likely location that these tree frogs use for mating. The frogs are rarely found on the ground. Most of the time they spend their lives on tree branches or in trees, high up off the ground and away from predators. Let's wrap up with our invasive species update. Aliaria pedialata, garlic mustard, has started to bloom in earnest this week. Most of the individuals found around McCormick Woods are currently blooming. Notice that the garlic mustard has flowers characteristic of the mustard family. Each flower has 4 white petals and they're produced in clusters at the apex of the plant. As a reminder, it's a good idea to pull these up where you find them. Make sure that you get the roots all the way out of the ground and hang them on something or put them on a hard impermeable surface so that they don't have a chance to reroot. Another good idea is to bring a plastic bag and to pack them out while you're hiking. Checking up on Lonicera this week, bush honeysuckle. We checked up on this plant a couple of weeks ago when honeysuckle started to become more obvious when driving down the roadway because of how it leaves out ahead of everything else and tends to colonize the edges of woods. The leafing out is continuing. To the right is another example of what it looks like at a wood's edge, but from a closer vantage point. As always, please remember to use the resources shown here to learn more about invasive species featured this week and in past episodes. As always, make sure to stay safe and practice physical distancing when you're outside, but make sure to get out and enjoy the great outdoors when you can.
Thanks for joining us for Wildflower Weekly. We'll see you next time.